Nice to be back here with all of you. We began the day with Andrew Steer, the CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, and we've had a jam-packed day talking about really all the places where the development sector intersects with climate. Uh, I've learned a lot. I hope you all have as well. We've come, believe it or not, to the end. And it's a conversation I've been looking forward to all day, and that's with Alice Albright, the CEO of the Millennium Challenge. And I want to invite Alice up here to the stage to join me for a conversation. Okay, so I think everybody here, and certainly the many people following us virtually, know Alice Albright, and they know you probably from some of your prior incarnations, including as the CEO of the Global Partnership for Education. What maybe not everybody knows is that you spent a lot of your career as a banker working in emerging markets. So I was always wondering when you took this job, and I know you've only been in it 9 months or something like that. You joined in February 2022. The Senate confirmed you. When we were going to see the kind of financial engineering expertise that you have come to light at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is famous for its model and sticking to its model year after year after year. And it turns out that yesterday was the day. You came here to COP and you made a big announcement about a move that MCC is making around blended finance. Connects really well to the conversation we had at the beginning of the day with Andrew Steer on what they're doing at the Bezos Earth Fund and the need to kind of reimagine how a lot of development organizations work. So let's dive in there, and we'll talk more about everything else that's on your mind related to climate and MCC. But begin with this big announcement. So you've come to the table saying you're going to put up $50 to $80 million, and it's going to be through a blended finance approach with USAID. It's going to help a few countries to really float green bonds, to get private finance they wouldn't have gotten before. Tell us a little bit more about why you're doing it, what it is.
Well, thank you, Raj, for inviting me, and it's wonderful to be with everybody. I hope everyone's had a good few days here at COP. It's my first time here, and it's sort of an incredible moment, I think. So it's great to be with you all. So let's talk about finance. So before I answer the specific question about what is our new thing, and we renamed it.
Since yesterday?
We've given it a better name, which is Climate Finance Plus.
We like to break news here at Devex, so that's good.
Right. We gave it a better name because I think it didn't quite roll off of everyone's tongue. So let's zoom out for a second. If you were to imagine a chart that lined up all the countries in the world according to how vulnerable they are to different dimensions of climate change, whether or not it's droughts or floods or food insecurity or an inability to get any kinds of services of any kind to their rural populations. You line those countries up. And then that's one sort of chart. And then the chart next to it, you line up where does all the private investment, institutional investment capital in the world go. Those charts look very different. And the investment capital in the world does not go to all the countries that are facing the most high degree of vulnerability to climate change. That's what has to change. And if you were then to do another edition of all of the overseas development aid, official development aid in the world, and throw on top of it a lot of the climate-related money that the development banks are putting together, it is a fraction of the price tag of what it's going to cost to actually help the countries who are most vulnerable to climate change pay for everything that needs to be paid for. That's what needs to change. So we need to figure out how to use public money to crowd in more private money and figure out how we can structure transactions, think about where different models of what countries need for adaptation, what can be financed, where are the revenue models where the private sector can come in that creates the revenue flow to pay back debt. And there's a lot of complicated operational and structuring types of questions that come into play. But if we're going to make a difference in helping the countries that need it most, pay for what they need to pay for, we have to think about how we finance it differently. And so our announcement yesterday it's a joint announcement with our friends at USAID, is an intention to look very specifically at this issue and try to figure out. And it's not just about one transaction or two. If somebody says, well, is 50 or $80 million going to really make a difference? That's not the right question. One of the problems we're trying to think about is that many countries that we work with at MCC don't really have all the right mechanisms in place to essentially create a market to attract capital. So this is the regulatory systems, the reporting systems. How do you structure transactions? How do you build a pipeline of transactions? How do you think about, credit risk rating processes? There's all this, financial stuff that has to happen. And so we are looking to build that along with our friends at USAID and create a much more systemic approach to this question than simply looking at a transaction or two.
Let's just level set for a second and then dig a little more into the details on this, right? Because I think people who know MCC know it for the work you do around infrastructure. It wasn't originally conceived to focus on infrastructure. It was conceived to focus on what countries wanted. But it turns out countries wanted infrastructure. So a lot of what MCC has done over the years is roads, it's water, it's electric, right? Those are the things you've focused on as a agency. And it turns out that a lot of those infrastructure projects could be financed with private money if there's some kind of a revenue stream, right? So in many countries, you get water out of your tap, but you're paying a bill for that, or you get electricity when you turn on the light switch, but there's a bill that you expect to get for that. And that revenue stream means it could be financed with private dollars.
Yes.
But until now, that isn't the way MCC has operated, right? You've basically operated in terms of just grants directly to countries to fund these kinds of projects.
All right, so let me back up for a second and tell people a little bit about MCC, and you've just outlined a good chunk of it. So very quickly, we were created in 2004. Since then, we've deployed $15 billion to 49 countries across a range of different sectors. You've named most of them, but they tend to be, if you were to generalize, the basics that countries need. We are a very country ownership driven organization, and that's not just rhetoric. What it means is that we work very closely with countries once they become eligible for them to identify what their biggest constraints to growth are. Now, they typically tend to be the basics. It is roads, transportation, water and sanitation, electricity is very common, health, education. Those tend to be the basics. Now, what you see is that the need to adapt to climate change does impact all of those different things in one way or another. So, for example, we've just done a significant compact in Mongolia, who is suffering a real lack of availability to water because different impacts of climate is changing how water patterns are around Ulaanbaatar. So we have just deployed $350 million to help them fix that problem. We've just deployed $420 million in Timor-Leste, of which about 350 is for the same purpose. So there is a strong cross-section between those areas that countries want to work on with us and what tends to be hit by different climate impacts. A very big example of that is agriculture, where drought has totally changed planting patterns, make it much more difficult for farmers to scale up their agricultural operations. Then you talk about different parts of the value chain, like how do you get goods to market. So we are not changing our business model at all, but we're taking a through cut through it and saying a lot of it is about, when countries want to work with us, is about climate resilience and adaptation. Now, back to our thing that we announced yesterday. We are still going to be a grant maker. And by the way, in this financial environment, being a grant maker is incredibly valuable because most countries are getting into high levels of debt distress. A lot of official money is loans. Those loans are getting a lot more expensive given the interest rate environment that we're in. So we give countries, the average size of our grant is $350 million. So it is a significant it's potentially very impactful type of financial instrument. So it can be used for all kinds of things. On the one hand, we can use it to build things, but on the other hand, we can use it to blend with private capital such that private capital comes in. So this is where the exploration work really needs to occur.
And I know this is just a pilot. Remind me the name again of this new pilot.
Climate Finance Plus.
Climate Finance Plus.
Climate Finance. See, it was good that we changed it.
Yeah.
Climate Finance Plus.
Yeah, I like it.
Yesterday it was something else. Tomorrow it's going to be Climate Finance Plus. We're not changing it again.
Well, there is another acronym, I guess, that people know, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, right? This started after MCC was created, but obviously the other big infrastructure game in town is the Chinese government through the Belt and Road Initiative. They have a very different approach, mostly lending.
Right.
But maybe you can just talk about where do you think what MCC is offering as you talk to the least developed countries and they're, pitching you with proposals for infrastructure, where you think what MCC is offering compares to what BRI is offering. How do you think about that in the context of the countries you're focused on?
Well, it's much more than the difference between MCC and what we see in the Belt and Road Initiative is about a lot more than a loan versus a grant. And it starts at what is MCC all about at the very beginning. So countries, and we have a very deliberate and intentional way of selecting countries to work with. The first thing is a country a low income or a lower middle income country? Then we have our scorecard, which is 20 indicators, which measures essentially 3 types of policy areas and choices that countries make. One is, are countries managing their economy effectively? Are they on a pathway to being more and more democratic and fighting corruption? And are they investing in their people? So we offer a model for countries advancing just in working with us that is quite different from where the Belts and Roads Initiative is. So countries get on a pathway in working with us. And there are a number, if you look at our website, there are a number of countries that we don't work with because they don't cross the scorecard. One of the extremely interesting things about our model is that there are many countries who would like to work with us. They pick up their scorecard from the internet. We publish all of them every year. In fact, we just published the last round last week. This week has gone fast. That's why I thought it was maybe this week. It was last week. And there are a number of countries who study their scorecard and adopt it as their road for reform without us spending $1 on the programming there.
That's what's called the MCC effect.
Correct. And it is real. And we meet regularly with those countries because they want to get on that kind of a pathway. So we offer a very different vision of the future in working with a U.S. government agency than what is underlying the Belts and Roads Initiative. Then you get to the financial piece, which is it a loan or is it a grant? And we are about grants. We then have a lot of other sort of specifics about how we work in terms of setting up an entity in the country that is under the auspices of usually the head of state's office. We work, that entity then becomes our sort of implementing partner. They then are the receiver of the grants. They then own the assets. They then implement the work. So it becomes a very sort of intentionally country-owned process that is not just about the selection, but then there's a lot of capacity and technical sort of assistance that comes alongside of that. It's quite different.
And what's the latest on your move to be able to do this kind of work, these compacts with middle-income countries?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a very live question. So we, some time ago, and this was very apt given the conditions in the world now, 12, 18, 24 months ago, we started looking at the question of where does poverty occur and what does it look like. And we were initially set up to work in the low income and lower middle income countries, which is about 81 countries. And when we did the math and the number crunching and so forth around where does poverty occur, the answer is it's in more places than the low income and the lower middle income countries. Some countries have gotten poorer. Some countries may be just at the lower end of upper middle countries, but there are parts of them that are very, very challenged. There are also parts of countries that are, the overall country may be upper middle income, but there are parts of them that are still very lower middle income or low income. So we started thinking about the value proposition of the agency and where should it work? And the answer is we should be working in more countries. So we are in the process of working with the Hill, our Congress, in getting some legislation passed to see if we can't work in a broader range of countries. And that piece of legislation has now passed the House and it is sort of under consideration by the Senate. And our agency has got strong bipartisan support in so both parties, both houses. And so we're hopeful that that piece of legislation will be passed. And then those countries will still have to go through the scorecard and our sort of regular process. But we think we can make a difference working in our sort of normal way of working in a broader range of countries because poverty is more prevalent than it was. And that's a function of COVID, of climate change, just those two factors alone. And there's a lot more other factors. We can talk about the impact of Russia's invasion in Ukraine and food security and fertilizer and food. I mean, there's a lot of things that have happened in the last, 2, 3 years that have made a lot of countries poorer
And more indebted,
and more
having a
indebted.
hard time to pay back these loans. And it may not be your intention, but when I think of the Belt and Road Initiative, right, and I think of the fact that you may now be able to give grants to middle income countries and then leverage those grants with private sector money coming in through green bonds, it starts to look more like America's answer in a way to the Belt and Road Initiative. Maybe the scale is less, but I know you're saying just from this pilot, you think maybe about $1 billion could be crowded in of private finance. So it starts to look like if you were to do more of this beyond the pilot, if Climate Finance Plus extends, maybe it changes a little bit of what MCC is offering in this kind of global market vis-a-vis BRI. How do you see that?
Well, we need to get started. We have done a lot of work around what is the potential crowding in sort of leverage effect, leverage not borrowing, catalyzing. That's a tricky word in this context.
Right, because well, the governments would be borrowing, but it's actually the infrastructure
We're not issuing
projects.
bonds,
Right,
right? It's the at the project level.
right.
So let's get started. It is our intention is to help these countries as much as we can. So we need to get started. I think if you look at the overall value proposition of what we're offering, it does become to be a compelling alternative choice to help countries finance key aspects of what they're trying to contend with right now.
Yeah. I mean, so much of climate, I've heard this from experts who work on these issues, comes down to water. We had Hindu Ibrahim on stage earlier, and her region of Lake Chad, it went from very dry, not enough water, to way too much water with floods, right? And that's the story in much of the world. It's too much water or too little water back and forth. And the funding that's going to be required to deal with water, just that alone, is going to be one of the biggest infrastructure investments required in our history.
Yeah.
And I imagine that many of the countries submitting proposals to MCC and the world leaders you're talking to at these countries, they're talking about water.
Well, it's about water, drainage. How do you get water in the places where you need it, where you don't have it? How do you protect road infrastructure from floods? It's, yes, a lot of it is. And then, if you look at countries like Mozambique, where we're also in the process of designing a very significant compact, their coastline runs a distance that, if you're measuring it sort of according to kind of similar distances, at least in the United States, their coastline is analogous to Miami to Boston. And most of the population in that country live on the coastline, and most of the people are very dependent on forms of fishing for their livelihood. So when the dynamics of that coastline change, when the availability of fish change, when those markets are overfished, all of a sudden it has huge impacts on the overall livelihood of that country. So that's an example where a country is naturally exposed to water, and the changes in that is going to change how that country is able to move forward. So this is why it's one of the countries that we're really throwing a lot of effort into right now because we want to help.
We've just got about a minute left, but I want to get from you your overall take. This is your first COP, and you've been in this role less than a year. It is an intense week with so many tens of thousands of delegates and organizations, each with their own set of issues and priorities and messages. What do you take away from this? What do you think is kind of the big headline coming out of this year's COP for you?
Well, it's been an incredible week and an incredible experience. One of the things that I'm most proud of is how much the U.S. government has shown up. We have a huge U.S. government presence, and everybody is sharing incredible ideas and commitment to doing their part within the mandates of their agency to really help. The president announced something called "Prepare," the President's Emergency Response for Adaptation and Resilience, if I'm getting my acronyms right. And that's a whole of government approach where a lot of agencies have been asked to get involved. We're actually chairing the infrastructure, co-chairing the infrastructure piece of it. Seeing the U.S. government show up in force to COP is great. And I'm so glad we're here, and we need to keep at it. So that's one takeaway. It is remarkable to hear the ingenuity and the commitment and how so many different country partners are trying different things. I was on 2 panels today with our dear friends from Niger, who we're doing a lot of work with in the whole area of agriculture. And they are all in. They've set up all kinds of interesting things going on there. So a lot of countries are all in. I think there is a notable sense of urgency about this topic, although I wasn't here, I wasn't in Glasgow, so I can't quite benchmark it, before and after. I think the fact that there was a whole day on finance is getting exactly the problem in the room. And this is largely a finance problem. And we have to really lean into that one. And I hope that that one continues on through, the World Bank meetings in the fall and, in the spring, and so forth and so on, because this really is a finance problem to a large, well, not to a large extent, but to a notable extent. So I'm very glad that there was a big day about that. I do want to thank the Egyptian government for hosting us. This is a wonderful place to be, and I think it's led to a lot of great discussions. So I hope I get invited to the one next year. It's a big deal, and we are, as an agency, very, very proud to be here.
Well, I think you've shown up in a big way this year at COP. Thank you for making Devex at COP part of your agenda. We really appreciate the conversation. Please join me in thanking Alice Albright.
Thank you very much, Raj. Great to be with you. Thank you.